Greater than that, as of this past weekend, is President McKinney now.
Yeah, excellent. All right. Well, we're thrilled to have you presenting this morning, Zeke. So take it away.
Yeah, sorry about being a couple minutes late there. I was having trouble connecting. I apologize to everyone who was sitting here patiently waiting to get started. I'm just going to get my slides shared here, and then we're all set. Don't worry, I can go through this pretty quickly, so shouldn't be any problem. Thank you all for attending. All right, everyone should be able to see this? Yes?
Yes, sir. It's visible.
Yes. Yep. Looks great, Zeke.
Thank you. So I just gave this talk last weekend at the Central States Occupational Environmental Medicine meeting, and so was asked also to give it here at Grand Rounds, and I've presented this a few times here around Health Partners. So we're going to be talking about law enforcement violence in the Black community as a catalyst for clinician engagement in social justice. Big acknowledgments to Dr. Rushing, who was very much a big initiator of this project. Dr. Abrar, our former department chair, Dr. Montoya Barthelemy, our assistant program director, and Dr. Eduardo Medina, one of our colleagues from Park Nicollet Family Medicine and a colleague of mine from medical school. So I don't really have a financial interest in this topic, though I'm really quite interested in it personally. I'm totally willing to share this content. The only slight concern I have is we haven't published this yet. Fortunately, we did submit this as a paper just last night, yet again. So hopefully we'll see how that goes from there. And I'm not an expert on this, but I'll do what I can here. So we're going to talk about law enforcement violence as a public health issue. We're going to talk about the unique impact of law enforcement violence on the Black community. What can we clinicians do about this inequity? And some conclusions. So I'm going to probably go really fast through the first couple of sections to make sure we have time to talk about the third, and then of course some time for folks to have a little bit of discussion before 8 o'clock, because I know that will be a hard cutoff for many of you. So this is just a brief outline, but we'll just dive right in. So as everyone knows, back on May 20th, George Floyd was murdered here in Minneapolis, and by the police, no doubt. And I mean, you can see the picture of the mural that we're all familiar with there. But interestingly, this actually really spread into national and international unrest about this issue. I mean, I have a picture here of, the protest from Brussels, and like, who would have thought that in Belgium they would have really been that concerned about the plight of Black people here in the United States, but they were. So there was a protest here on June 6th at the state capitol, organized by medical students from the University of Minnesota under the organization White Coats for Black Lives. Our local chapter of the Minnesota Association of African American Physicians was present there, but as were done by medical students and other health professionals and even members of the general public who were interested in this topic. So things were happening. So the question I want to start with, is this really a new issue? And so I've been able to play this every single time I've presented it, so I'm pretty sure it's going to work now. And to be clear, I'm not showing that video to be flip, but rather to say that, when I was 18 years old when that came out, it was funny to me and maybe other people of color who knew about this issue forever. And now everybody knows about this. It's no big deal. But here we are, 2021, and apparently people still don't know about this. And apparently people aren't aware that's still an issue. Fun fact, it's very surprising that I was able to find a 20 to 30 second clip of Dave Chappelle where he did not swear or use the N-word. So that was fortunate for my purposes. Where are we at here? So the World Health Organization declares violence generally as a public health issue, and this is since 1996 by the World Health Assembly. But essentially the big points are that violence has a huge impact at the community, the individual, and at society level. So, I mean, this is a very prevalent issue that, is of concern. But more, and the way they define it is really, again, importantly about the intentional use of force, whether it's physical or threatened, against you can even be violent against your own self, against another person, against a group or a community, but ultimately resulting in some very severe adverse outcome, injury, death, psychological harm, development, or deprivation. But law enforcement violence, on the other hand, is a little bit more tricky to define, and part of that's because we've used a lot of terminology to describe this in the literature over time. Justifiable homicide, or excessive force by law enforcement, or death by legal intervention is my favorite or least favorite one. But ultimately, police brutality, law enforcement violence is really a subset of societal violence as defined. And this is really, again, about the excessive physical force by law enforcement agents while doing their job, ultimately causing some harm or injury to the victim, and in violation of their human rights. And that's an important point, too. Well, why is that? Well, police ultimately have a social contract with society about, being able to protect us and take care of us. And when people are perpetuated violence by the police, that is a crossing a barrier of our civil rights. And ultimately, our civil rights are designed to protect us as citizens from unfair treatment. And so ultimately, we have to balance civil rights with police power, partially because police here in the United States have had an enormous amount of power and protection. Unfortunately, though, this has resulted, maybe on purpose or not, in more police misconduct towards, communities of color. And it's rare for police to be charged or even convicted. So, on the right, you see pictures from the police officer who shot Philando Castile and a protest when he was acquitted. And we've seen, even of the 1,000 people who are killed annually by police, only 42 convictions have occurred since 2005. And it's still quite rare, like now, for police to be charged. So I'm not some kind of genius, and I didn't make this all up. The American Public Health Association said in 2018 that law enforcement violence is a public health issue. So this is not even my thing. I'm just trying to spread this message to a clinical audience. And why is this important? Well, it's preventable. That's, one of the most important things for a public health issue. It actually disproportionately affects some communities. It has a high cost to all of us. It affects communities as a whole and the population, and ultimately is going to require systemic solutions. And APHA makes some recommendations here, and I'm not going to go into that specifically. But what are some of the barriers? Well, we have this definitional problem I described. Lots of terms use this, making it hard to find in the literature or hard to capture this very well. There's a legal issue of the fact that a judge is the one adjudicating whether or not force on behalf of police is excessive or appropriate. We don't have standardized data collection, so nationally there's no standardized system. Reporting by states is pretty much voluntary, and to be honest, mostly they're not even capturing anything beyond fatal injuries. And so there's a lot of discrepancy in collecting things broadly. The most contemporary system for this is a CDC National Violent Death Reporting System, which is better than things we've had, but still has some limitations. So how is this a problem for the Black community? Well, there's certainly strong evidence that this exists, regardless of these issues in data collection. ProPublica looked at 12,000 police homicides from 1980 to 2012 and showed young Black males are 21 times more likely to be killed by police. I can tell you that I was born in 1981, so right at the beginning of that time period, and this has been an effect that's been fairly evident to me my entire life, and this is something that I have to think about every time I interact with the police, which unfortunately is more than I would like as well. They looked at this and saw, even of teenagers who were under 14 years old, that were killed, most of those were Black, most of these were by handgun, and unfortunately, most of these were perpetuated by white officers on communities of color. So is this a disparity or an equity? Well, a disparity is when we see these discrepant outcomes that may be associated with, social, economic, environmental disadvantages. But ultimately, if there's no obvious disparity in police brutality, then we should call it a health disparity. But if these discrepant outcomes are unnecessary and preventable and even unjust, that would be an inequity. And so I think we can probably agree, based on the available data, that police brutality or law enforcement violence is an inequity. There's contemporary media evidence of this. I mean, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation looked at 5 years of information and saw, some of the 14 high-profile cases where this happened. There were deadly weapons or lethal maneuvers used when ultimately they could have done something less fatal. And I mean, at the time I made this, most recently it was George Floyd. There's actually been others since then. So everyone's favorite picture is this issue of equality versus equity. And I think somebody's not on mute because I swear I hear my echo every so often. But on the left, you see reality where everyone wants to see a baseball game and there's a barrier in the way. Some people have more resources than others to see that, and some people aren't even able to see the game. And in fact, so far in the whole, they're not going to see the game. Equality in reality would be providing everyone the same resources, regardless of what the outcome is. That's the second picture there. The third picture is equity. Okay, well, let's give everybody the right amount of resources so we all get to the same level. We can all see this game. But we should be shooting for a world where there's no barrier at all. And so it doesn't really matter where you're starting. We could all have the same access to the outcome we want, in this case, seeing the baseball game, in reality not being people impacted by systemic racism, whether it's in healthcare or law enforcement violence or whatever. So the historical context of law enforcement violence in the Black community really has started back in the antebellum era of the United States with slave patrols, which were one of the earliest forms of modern U.S. policing in the way we know it now, and was really designed to control the slave population who outnumbered the population of white people in the southern United States. Following the Civil War, we had the implementation of the Black Codes, which followed the Supreme Court ruling Dred Scott versus Sanford, which said those of African descent cannot become U.S. citizens. And I hope you can appreciate that less than 200 years ago, being told that, you know, for who I am and what my descent is, I can't be a citizen of the country, at least I was born in. That's kind of scary. But, you know, these were laws that were designed to limit the rights of freed slaves and ultimately serve to continue to reestablish white supremacy as it existed then and result in an increased arrest and incarceration of Black people, somewhat akin to what we know now. Now people say, well, we went into the civil rights era, maybe things got better, and the answer was not so much. We had the Jim Crow laws. This was as a function of the Supreme Court ruling Plessy versus Ferguson, which basically legalized racial segregation under the premise that things could be separate but equal. And ultimately, this, again, continued to give power to police to oppress and brutalize the Black community. And ultimately, they either turned a blind eye to or actively participated in public lynchings of Black people, women, men, children, everybody. And I wasn't alive to see white and colored restrooms, but some of you on this call were. So structural racism has impacted policing in a number of ways, but let's just talk about the definition of structural racism, which is the totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination through mutually reinforcing systems, that's important, of housing, education, employment, earnings, benefits, credit, media, healthcare, and criminal justice. That list sounds familiar. Why have I heard that before? Oh, gee, I think it sounds a lot like social determinants of health, which is also a mutually reinforcing system by which people have worse health outcomes. We see, because of this, increased criminalization of Black males, causing this increased susceptibility to law enforcement violence in the ways that I described on the last slide, but also in contemporary times, even with, you know, Black people being incarcerated at greater rates and consequently advancing the prison industrial complex in the United States. Contemporarily, in modern times, we've seen this yet again. You know, people who are stopped for, you know, whether it's by racial profiling or some other reason, people who are attacked by police when they're unarmed and fleeing and considered to be some kind of significant threat. We've seen this happen, you know, over the years, more recently with things like stop and frisk in New York, where they had more than 200,000 stops basically without reasonable suspicion. Most of these people were Black and, as a subset, Latinx, but ultimately this led to more than 2 times as many stops and tickets and arrests, and again, consequent disparities in law enforcement action against communities of color. Some people theorize the 1970s war on drugs, which expanded police powers and to some degree eroded civil protections, again, also was a function that caused a disproportionate effect on the Black community. Well, what we know is systemic racism will impact health overall. So on the left, you see the lovely slide from Healthy People 2020, talking about the various elements of the social determinants of health that we're aware of. On the right, I have this other picture, which is a causal web, really with increased maternal and infant mortality in the middle, something that we know impacts the Black community as well. But look at all the big historical things that are on the outside here: slavery, Jim Crow, the 13th Amendment, redlining, and then leading to, again, the things that we will also know as, you know, both issues of social determinants of health and racism, but rates of incarceration, access to care, housing, income, etc. Some people would go so far as to say racism is its own social determinant of health. Because again, it's the organized systems that cause avoidable and unfair inequalities in all these same dimensions across racial or ethnic groups. I would argue racism would fit on the left in this bubble of social and community context. We know that systemic racism impacts mental health, and I hope it's not surprising that when all these factors are stacked against you from the day you're born, you will have to live in a state of underlying anxiety. And let me assure you, I'm there, and I've been there. Surgeon General said members of ethnic and racial minority groups in the U.S. face a social and economic environment of inequality that includes greater exposure to racism, discrimination, violence, and poverty, unsurprisingly, all of which take a toll on mental health. I added the unsurprisingly. We also see this, in a number of ways that people interact with society, whether it's through communication, through the way they seek support, through the way doctors interact with them, and through the same stigma that exists for everyone around mental illness, but it may just be worse when your race plays a role there. Maybe that's not a surprise to you. It shouldn't be. So I have a couple slides about workers' compensation. I'm not going to go into this very broadly, but mostly, one, because we're the audience for that, but two, after the George Floyd riots, I ended up seeing a lot of police officers for PTSD, some of which really got set off because of the riots, including for police officers of color who did not want to be there and felt like they were maybe on the wrong side of things, but because they were forced to, as a function of their job, they were there and they were getting yelled racial epithets and called a race traitor and being attacked. And that stuff obviously has a big impact on people's psyche when something, is so near and dear to your heart and you have to maybe stand up against it. That may be a problem. So as we know, historically, mental injuries, that is mental injuries leading to mental impairments, were not historically covered under Minnesota workers' compensation, but PTSD is the exception in recent times. And more importantly, there's even an occupational presumption for first responders for that. So we see that systemic racism and policing have also had impacts on health because of increased race-based violence, increased mental, emotional, and physical stressors, the increased likelihood of hazardous work settings and a work-related injury. And by the way, if you haven't noticed, COVID-19 has affected communities of color at disparate rates, and to some insignificant amount, that's because of more hazardous work conditions or more work settings in which people will be more greatly exposed. It turns out that all these things lead to, reduced access to secure employment and housing and education and healthcare. Does it sound like I'm repeating myself? Because I probably am, because that's how much this stuff is systemic, and these are those mutually reinforcing systems I talked about a few minutes ago. So we see, and data supports everything I'm about to say, increased mortality, we see increased physical injuries, we see increased emotional injuries, we see increased engagement with the legal system, and more Black men are incarcerated than anybody else. We know that. We see increased impacts on people financially, whether it's because of these legal issues, because of these medical issues, even because of potentially funeral costs. All these things are impacting families even beyond the initial issues themselves. So this is where I'm going to slow down a little bit and talk about what can we do about this, because I think this is maybe the most important part of what I'm going to say, but I thought it's also important to understand the history of this in the context. It turns out we are not, as clinicians or physicians, immune to systemic racism. There has been demonstrated repeatedly through the literature implicit bias against BIPOC communities. This can impact our medical decision-making in a number of ways. It can impact our communication with patients in a number of ways. I like this diagram on the left because it says, okay, well, maybe we have some implicit bias, and that could lead to our Black patients having, dissatisfaction or mistrust or distrust, and ultimately could lead to low adherence or low healthcare utilization. I think that's true. Well, if you look at the second one, what can we do in there? Well, we can interact in between the step of having some implicit bias and them actually having developed some mistrust and distrust, or our contribution to that, by changing our communication and our behavior to really help reestablish that trust or help break down some of those barriers. And unfortunately, what we see is there's bad framing of the interventions. People talk about cultural sensitivity and cultural competence, but often this training we have doesn't talk about why these communities or how these communities mistrust and distrust healthcare and healthcare research. There's a lot of work being done talking about historical and contemporary peripheral traumas. How does it make me feel as a Black man when I see George Floyd shot down on TV? What does it make me think about myself? What does it make me think about my kids? What does it make me think about my 18-year-old nephew who's very much Black and very much darker skinned than me? Right around the time that George Floyd was murdered, I was about to give my nephew my old Prius, which is a nice car for an 18-year-old. But I had a big crack in the windshield, from driving to Central States down in Chicago or whatever, and it wasn't that big and it didn't really bother me. But I knew very clearly in my heart of hearts, I had to fix that windshield before I gave it to my 18-year-old nephew, because him driving around with a cracked windshield might have been too much of a risk factor for him getting pulled over by the police. And in fact, more than might, it was. And so I called my insurance company and paid for it and got it fixed so my nephew could be safe. And that's just something I new I just had to do. Nobody told me that. It's not an instruction book for that. That's just my navigation of society as a black man. And by the way, these peripheral traumas are, like I said, whether it's law enforcement violence or some of the harmful issues in the history of research we've seen, like with Tuskegee, anything. So what's our social responsibility for this? Well, the fourth principle in medical ethics is justice. Now, some people think that means only in the exam room. You shouldn't offer one person something you're not going to offer to somebody else. Like, so some people might argue, for example, Donald Trump, when having COVID and getting the most experimental treatment ever and, very easily surviving and having no problems at 72 years old, might not be indicative of what else should be happening in reality. And maybe that's true. But I would say also outside of the exam room, we have an issue to address these issues of social justice, whether it's social determinants of health, or more specifically, systemic racism, or even more specifically, law enforcement violence, because these are all things that are impacting our patients, arguably more than our ability to, give somebody a blood pressure medication. We all know this. Social determinants of health are a bigger impact on health than our ability to care for people. Some people have argued we have responsibility for advocacy, and people have noticed that there are gaps in in medical education about trying to address this topic. Where et al. In 2017 said very much we need to integrate social justice in our medical education, and this is the argument I'm making here, partially because we have a lot of agency. Doctors, nurses, healthcare professionals have a lot of high social status. Doctors, nurses, health professionals have a lot of high socioeconomic status, certainly relative to other people in the population. I would even go so far as to say we, as preventive medicine physicians, should be stewards of this because we know that injury prevention is predicated on the fact that injuries are not accidents. So ultimately, we know this is preventable, and thus this is predictable and non-random, and we need to do something to address these inequities. And here's just another picture from a White Coat for Black Lives protest in Seattle. Again, far from here, but this was an issue that sparked people's interest. So I'm making the argument that this is not only for law enforcement to address, because this affects community health and it's preventable and impacts multiple dimensions of health. Therefore, we have to do something about it. And ultimately, this is yet another way in which we are reinforcing those mutually reinforcing power structures. And this is the same basis for, this is the same issues based on race that we're seeing for other health inequities. And we know race is not biological. So we are presenting some solutions to address this on the individual level, on the institution level, and the population level. So at an individual level, you have to be actively anti-racist. It's not enough to just say, well, I'm not racist and I don't believe in racism and I don't, that we're not going to talk about it because I don't believe in it. That's not okay. Silence is violence. You have to actively speak up and say, look, when I see something racist, this is going to be a problem and I'm going to step up and do something about it. You have to individualize care for your patients. I assume we're all doing that already, but we can do it even more. Now, in some ways, you want to make sure we're not in contrast with the medical ethical principle of justice, but rather that we are knowing the people we are serving and understanding how their story impacts them. Think about the barriers that they may have to engaging in healthcare, whether it is all these social determinants of health or just distrust or mistrust of the healthcare system. We have to stop labeling our patients and blaming them for the problems that society's put on them. Calling people difficult. I just had a conversation with a clinician about this yesterday. Non-compliant, a malingerer. People talk about people having supratentorial problems. We can't do that. I'm not going to blame Philando Castile for being shot by the police simply because he lived a life in Minnesota and even because he had a gun. He had a right to do all those things, and none of that made it okay for him to get shot. And the same thing is true of our patients. It's not okay for us to be mad at a patient for not taking their blood pressure medication when maybe they can't afford that blood pressure medication, or maybe when they don't have a place to live. We can't assume everyone has resources in that same way. We also can't assume everyone's going to speak English well, and we can't necessarily go ahead and try to provide people care when we don't have an interpreter available to necessarily represent their point of view. We have to keep considering how treatment algorithms may ignore or even perpetuate systemic disparities, and there's plenty of literature on that. Ultimately, you have to listen and believe your patients. I know you all have heard this before, but think about the number of times that patients come in and tell you about the fact that, I'm telling everybody this problem. I don't feel anyone's listening to me. I don't feel anyone believes me. I hear that all the time. And that tells me we can do a better job listening. I'm sure we can. I know we're busy, and we just have to stop and listen to people and believe them. Because who am I to tell somebody what their experience is? In terms of personal development, you can sit down and try to read about systemic racism and all these things I've talked about, which I'm only covering very briefly. You can look at the historical context of this, where, for example, the Tuskegee syphilis study is maybe one of the more famous ones in the Black community, but there's plenty of stuff outside of the Black community. Marion Sims, who was considered the father of modern OBGYN and experimented on slaves without their consent, maybe evidently. Henrietta Lacks, whose cells were used in the development of major biological advances worldwide. All these different things that, again, are these peripheral traumas as to why people have mistrust and distrust of the healthcare system or healthcare research. Look, at the end of the day, just, check out media made by people of color. People complained after the Golden Globes that, Emily in Paris got all these awards. But what about Issa Rae and Insecure, a wonderful show on HBO made by a Black woman? In fact, I'll tell you, that show is amazing. You should watch it. But it's as simple as, getting the Minnesota Spokesman Recorder, reading the Sahan Journal. Read things that are being said by these communities and by individuals of color who talk about their own experience. And at the end of the day, don't rely on me or other people of color to validate you and try to educate you. You have to do that yourself. You have to do that work yourself. I don't have time to do it for everybody. I barely have enough time to do this. And you also have to think about, when you hear somebody like me talking about this, or when somebody maybe confronts you about something, or you just come across something that you may have some resistance to this or some bias already, and you have to try to just step back from that and be okay with what you're hearing. And that goes for me too. With your peers, you need to be willing to have these tough conversations. Like I said, I just literally had to talk to somebody yesterday who called a Black patient difficult. And I said, well, hold on. I'm not saying this person's easy, but let's consider all the reasons why that may be, all the social determinants of health that may be contributing to them not engaging in care in the way we would like. And similarly, that's why we have to reframe stereotypes that people have. You have to organize educational sessions like this based on specific topics or literature. We should start looking at, the ways in which we use racist wordplay. People talking about, let's have a guru. He's a guru on something. Let's have a powwow. Calling people uppity. We can't do all that, and that's not okay, and you shouldn't talk to people like that. In terms of the institution level, we have to be inclusive, and we have to advocate to hire, more representative people of our population. So, for example, should we pay, professionals of color more? Yeah, maybe, because they've had to deal with this their whole life. Should we offer them more access to loan repayment? Sure. I mean, would I say we should offer these things to everybody? Yeah, probably. But my point is, if you're wondering why here at Health Partners we don't see that many Black male physicians, it's because they might be getting a better gig elsewhere. Maybe that's why in Minnesota they might be getting a better gig elsewhere. I don't know, but we have to look at this, and we have data on this, so we can prove it. You have to partner with the community and talk to underserved communities and organizations to, have them be a partner rather than you telling them what you're going to do for them. And orient your outreach to figure out what those concerns are and make it relevant to what the community's concerns are based on what you can offer them. Ultimately, we need to offer better access to, communities who don't have good access, whether it's to healthcare or research or, for example, COVID-19 vaccines right now, which is a major issue. And we have to stop taxing all our, token individual people of color institutions like ours. Honestly, all I do all day long nowadays in the past 6 to 9 months is talk about health equity and COVID-19 and health equity. This is becoming a big part of my life, and let me assure you, it's not part of my FTE. I'm moderating a panel for the Minnesota Medical Association about health equity as it pertains to vaccines later today. Think about in educational settings how faculty and trainees need to represent a more inclusive and open environment. In medicine, we know that's not been the case. Think about how when we evaluate people in educational settings, we are favoring people who look like or are like the evaluators. You know how it is. You meet somebody you work with and you're like, oh yeah, you also have a cabin up near Bemidji. Oh yeah, your family's also from this other part of the state. Oh yeah, you also like to fly fish, whatever it is. Those people who have those things in common with you, those are the people you're going to like more. Just going to pick on Ralph Bavard, even though I love him to death. Ralph loves people who do the Birkebeiner like he does. But I'm going to tell you, it's probably more rare to find Black people who are necessarily doing that. Not that they wouldn't be willing to do it, but they may not have been exposed to it. And we have to have curriculums that talk about social determinants of health. For those of you who went to medical school here, and certainly in my era, that was not something talked about as much as I think it should have been. And we have to keep fighting against use of race-based medicine practices, such as EGFR, which, even to this day is reported differently for everybody versus black people, where it looks like black people have better kidney function, which sounds great. Okay, maybe black people are doing better than white people in some way. That's awesome. Well, it's not awesome, because if you actually have kidney problems, you actually need a kidney transplant, it's going to take you longer to get there. You want to know what's worse? It's really not based on science. It's based on some premise that black people have more muscle mass than white people, which I think we know is a ridiculous premise and is not supported by data. And we see similar things with spirometry, where underrepresentation of communities of color in research is leading us to poor inferences of research outcomes. At a population level, we have to advocate for mandatory and national surveillance for accurately reporting these types of injuries, and not just fatal ones. We have to pursue research to keep doing this sort of stuff. Did anybody pay me to put this paper together, or this presentation? No, I wish. We need to take legislative action to name systemic racism a public health crisis, and people have done this. I don't think we've done it yet, but we should. Because we are privileged financially, we need to use our wallet and use that to, spend it on organizations that support issues of social justice, and preferentially those who are serving underserved communities. And we have to get people we know to use their money too, because we know people who have money as well. We similarly know people in positions of power, and we need to talk to them, whether it's our bosses here at the hospital, or legislatures we know, or our friends in power who run nonprofits or banks or whatever it is. We have to talk to all of them. And we also have to recommend specific actions, such as the one that I'm talking about right now, to really make sure that we're addressing these disparities and inequities based on interventions that advocacy groups are doing. Again, doing it in partnership with the community and bringing our political capital to bear on that. And at the end of the day, get engaged with the media, whether it's on social media, on Twitter or Facebook, or write an op-ed to the Star Tribune, like our buddy Tom Cockey and Bavard do a lot. Get the word out there about issues of importance to you. And you can even tell stories about when maybe you made a mistake or had a misstep in the context of a racial scenario, and use that as a point to teach people how, wow, you know what, we still do have a lot to learn, because it's not ever going to be over. Not for a long time. So look, at the end of the day, is this uncomfortable? Yes, and that's expected, because when you're looking at being privileged or biased, that's going to be uncomfortable. The concept of privilege blindness is one that I find really fascinating, where people who are privileged are totally blind to it. I am blind as a man to some of the hardships that women experience in the workforce all the time, because I just maybe don't notice it. To women, that is obvious all the time, every day. And the same thing is true whether you're white or black. The privileges that white people have to speak with authority and force, I don't have, and that's been evident to me every day of my life. People joke about how calm Obama was as a president. Well, I'm telling you, it's because as a black man, he knew you couldn't be out there speaking maybe the way I'm speaking right now in this talk. And in fact, probably before George Floyd's murder, you would have been hard-pressed for me to talk to this degree about this topic. I wrote an article at the beginning of last year for Minnesota Medicine talking about the anxiety of underrepresentation in medicine, and that's a real thing. So, look, we have a power and responsibility to understand what are hurting our patients and our populace, whatever the cause may be. But it's not just a black and white issue, it's an American issue. And really, we need to look at how law enforcement violence and systemic racism affect us all by continuing to perpetuate these same social power dynamics that impact community health. And we have to feel like that our own freedoms are being threatened by this still existing in the U.S. Otherwise, we won't be able to develop the will as a community and a society to fight this. So, one last thing from J.L. Kessler, the former dean of Baylor University. And I'm just going to read this, so bear with me. Until we face the issue as human in its human relations, until we think of all citizens as human beings with human rights, human interests, and human possibilities, until we insist upon equality of opportunity, economic, industrial, educational, equality before the law, equal sanitary provision, equal protection of person and property, until we become conscious of a common brotherhood and cease to exploit the weak and treat them as chattels and property, until we play fair and put justice into our program for less fortunate individuals and races, until we put democracy into our own life as we speed its splendid hope to the world, we are not even in sight of a solution, and futility faces our tasks of reform. So thank you for attending this talk, and I appreciate any feedback. I know this is uncomfortable, but if there's a way in which I can make this unhelpful, or more helpful rather, love to do so. Thank you.